After the attacks of 9/11, the city took bids from various architects and artists for potential memorials. A decision was made early on to forego simply rebuilding the towers as they'd once stood, and instead to incorporate the trauma of the attacks into the city's life. Michael Arad's proposal for a fountain installation entitled Reflecting Absence was ultimately selected. In his artist's statement, he explained how the idea for his installation came to him. The first idea I had was to carve two huge voids in the middle of the Hudson River, with water flowing into them, yet never filling them up. You would be able to stand on the shore and see these inexplicable voids, but you would not be able to go up to them. The artist's statement tells us what he imagined, and we can easily understand how this initial vision was transformed into the installation that now defines the space where the towers once stood. But what is not explained is how he decided to create emptiness rather than represent what was lost, or fill in the wound in the city's architecture by building a new structure on top of the old foundation. In 1915, Sigmund Freud wrote an essay entitled Mourning and Melancholia. In it, he explains that the key difference between the two conditions comes down to the ability of the conscious mind to reflect upon a loss. He gives the example of a betrothed girl who has been jilted, and through a series of abstractions, he describes how it is the case that one girl might mourn the loss of her future marriage and the other fall into self-destructive melancholia in reaction to the trauma. The first girl can understand what has happened, can describe who and what she has lost. The melancholic girl can only partially name what was taken from her. She is unclear about the meaning of the loss. Who was it that left her? What was their love worth? What was she worth? One possible consequence of a failure to mourn, a failure to fully grasp what has been lost, is illustrated in a pop song written by Charles Carpenter, Louis Dunlap, and Earl Hines in 1931, and covered by the young rockabilly American singer Brenda Lee in 1961. When performed by the then 16-year-old Lee on The Perry Como Show, she embodied the self-sacrificing, melancholic teenager who, through her immaturity and due to her undeveloped ego, imagines that the boy who broke her heart will define her whole life. In the song, Brenda pledges her undying devotion while underscoring how she expects nothing in return as he pursues love and happiness with another. Nothing but perpetual loneliness.
But baby, I gotta confess how they love me.
It is a romantic and light treatment of melancholia, one that Como's audience surely didn't take seriously, but could celebrate as a mark of Lee's naive sweetness and pure heart. She'll get over this boy, but in the meantime, she will feel the loss of him deeply before working through it and understanding its relative unimportance. However, if we're to understand how it is that the people of New York decided to memorialize the attacks of September 11th by building a structure representing nothing, representing empty spaces or concrete instances of existential voids, we should not pass over Lee's pain, her melancholia, too quickly. We should avoid any glib enjoyment of her kitsch performance. In his 1938 essay on the fetish character in music and the regression of listening, Adorno wrote that light music and all culture produced for consumption or for exchange in the market cannot be experienced autonomously or through self-reflection, but rather is received and processed automatically. We gently laugh at Brenda Lee without a single thought. We receive her pain, her stuckness, and a moment of lost love in a careless way, as her performance is reduced to the level of a meaningless gesture, marked by flourishes, small glances, particular idiosyncratic gestures, as the song itself is drowned out by the entertainment industry between commercial breaks. Melancholia is a disorder whereby one fails to mourn and instead turns the loss inward against oneself. Rather than consciously understanding and interpreting the loss and the pain that attends it, the melancholic suppresses the reality of the loss in an effort to hold it in place, in an effort to cope with the lack of understanding, the confusion that follows the trauma in place of what Freud would describe as healthy grief. A culture that makes the loss of love something trivial, that cannot muster meaning out of ordinary unhappiness, is doomed to enact melancholia and to lose the capacity to mourn. We can mark the deterioration, the regression that the culture industry generates, to turn toward melancholia by evaluating how even kitsch art is losing its specificity and particularity, its historical grounding. One way this has been accomplished is through the intensification of our culture's orientation toward youth, which began in an explicit and universally recognized form in the post-war era. When Brenda Lee was performing on Perry Como's variety show, American culture was sentimental about love without cynicism. For example, in the musical The Sound of Music, all the usual and somewhat dubious tropes were deployed to create a kitsch experience that was easy to consume. We are presented with a natural girl whose loving heart can lead her into trouble. A girl who falls in love with a man whose grief after the loss of his first wife had shut him off from spontaneity and even kindness. Stripped of its World War II narrative, the true story that was crafted into a Hollywood spectacle, the musical is merely one of many examples of a certain trope, an approach to storytelling that contemporary critics would call the manic pixie dream girl formula. However, the film cannot be understood if the details are stripped away, and its claim to be based on a true story should not be ignored, even if we should not be credulous. Instead, what must be noted is that the love story, laden with cliches as it is, placed the characters into history and aimed not simply to reproduce the formula, but to generate understanding of the times in a formulaic way. When compared to a contemporary romantic comedy produced today during a time of crisis for Hollywood, for example, the Sydney Sweeney vehicle Anybody But You, The Sound of Music is comparatively realistic and even somewhat sophisticated. The characters in Anybody But You are teenagers in adult bodies, and their world is defined by opulent wealth and a kind of sexless beauty. The characters are adolescent without being childlike. They're underdeveloped despite the conscious market testing and physical sculpting that generated the image of perfection that they bring to the screen. Rather than presenting a story, the movie operates through a series of scenes that are written and performed with such simple-mindedness that the word intelligence is nearly erased from one's cultural vocabulary as the film makes its way across the circuits and lights up the requisite pixels on the computer screen near you. And yet, even in this film product, a certain amount of human charisma is required so that the sentiment and entertainment value can be realized. Sweeney and Powell are likable, even attractive, and while that isn't enough, it is at least something. The question today, 24 years after the 9/11 attacks, as the war in Iran threatens to repeat recent history, is this: can we understand what we've lost well enough, find a kernel of reality in the void, so that we might properly mourn? It is tempting today to repeat the protests and kitsch version of politics that have defined the first quarter of the 21st century. We are invited to strip away the last vestiges of charisma, of libido, of meaning that remain after more than a century of commodification and kitschification, and to repeat the process of self-abasement that is always the result of melancholia. It is tempting, but it is not necessary. The 9/11 memorial concretized the trauma of September 11th. A continual waterfall, an image of the descent into nothingness, is maintained at the expense of $28 million annually. We should not consider this to be money wasted, but rather as a necessary expense. We have not yet begun to build a new way of life in America. All we can do is take account of the loss, to attempt to make meaning out of it. And these fountains, built where the World Trade Center towers used to stand, mark the spot from where we should begin.